The coffee cup slipped from Dr. Benjamin Crawford's weathered hands, shattering against the FEMA trailer steps as the German Shepherd emerged from the morning mist. She wasn't alone. Cradled gently in her massive jaws was a limp puppy, its tiny body barely moving, blood matting the golden fur around a gaping wound. The shepherd's dark eyes, streaming with what looked impossibly like human tears, locked onto Ben's with desperate intelligence. Margaret O'Sullivan's scream pierced the September air from her neighboring porch. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God!" The elderly woman's rosary beads scattered across her steps as she stumbled backward, her hand clutching her chest. Ben's breath caught in his throat. 5 years ago, he'd held his daughter Emma's broken body in these same hands, watching life slip away while he stood helpless. Now, another innocent life hung in the balance, carried to him by a creature that somehow knew he was their last hope. "Not again," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't lose another one." But the shepherd stepped closer, lowering the dying puppy at his feet with infinite gentleness. Time stopped. Could he save what he'd failed to save before? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape of St. Bernard Parish, where FEMA trailers sat like scattered dice among the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving New Orleans suburb. 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina had torn through their lives, the community still bore the scars of nature's fury, much like the man who now stared at the dying puppy at his feet. Dr. Benjamin Crawford had built his reputation on steady hands and an unshakable calm, traits that had served him well during his 20-year career as a veterinarian and his tours as a military medic in Afghanistan. But that was before September 12, 2003. The date burned into his memory like a brand. The drunk driver who'd slammed into Sarah's minivan hadn't just taken his wife and 8-year-old daughter, Emma. He'd shattered Ben's faith in his ability to heal, to save, to matter. Now, at 52, Ben carried the weight of survivor's guilt in the gray streaks of his unkempt beard and the hollow spaces behind his blue eyes. The wedding ring he wore on a chain around his neck had become a talisman of failure, a constant reminder of the lives he couldn't save when it mattered most. His hands, once surgeon-steady, now trembled slightly each morning until the first sip of bourbon found its way into his coffee. The FEMA trailer had become his hermitage, a place where he could disappear from the expectations of his sister Rebecca in Chicago, who called weekly begging him to come home, and from the well-meaning neighbors who still believed healing was possible. He'd come to New Orleans to volunteer in the animal rescue efforts after Katrina, thinking that perhaps saving someone else's pets might ease the guilt of failing to save his own family's cat, Whiskers, who'd died in his arms at the emergency vet clinic the night of the accident. Margaret O'Sullivan, his 75-year-old Irish-American neighbor, had appointed herself his unofficial guardian angel, though he'd given her little encouragement. The widow lived alone in the shotgun house next door that she'd stubbornly rebuilt with her own arthritic hands, refusing her children's pleas to move to assisted living in Baton Rouge. Every morning she brought him coffee he rarely drank and meals he barely touched, chattering about her late husband Patrick, while Ben listened with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations were meant for the dead. The German Shepherd standing before him now was unlike any animal he'd encountered in the chaos following the hurricane. Her coat, despite being matted and dirty, showed signs of careful breeding, the kind of dog that would have cost thousands before the storm. But it was her eyes that held him captive, intelligent, purposeful, and filled with an almost human desperation that spoke of training, of duty, of a bond with humans that ran deeper than mere survival instinct. As Ben knelt beside the motionless puppy, he noticed the faded blue collar around the shepherd's neck, though the tags were too dirty to read. The puppy's breathing was so shallow that Ben had to place his ear against the tiny chest to confirm there was still life flickering inside. The wound on the left flank was deep, probably from debris or broken glass, and the puppy's gums were pale, a clear sign of blood loss that made Ben's stomach clench with familiar dread. This was exactly how it had started with Whiskers, the desperate rush to save something small and innocent, the frantic calculations of time versus trauma, the crushing weight of responsibility he'd sworn he'd never shoulder again. "I don't do this anymore," he whispered to the German shepherd, whose dark eyes never left his face. But even as the words left his mouth, his hands were already moving with muscle memory, gently probing the puppy's injuries with the practiced touch that had once made him one of the most sought-after veterinarians in Metairie. The shepherd whined softly, a sound so human in its desperation that it made Ben's chest tighten. The puppy stirred weakly at his touch, and one tiny paw lifted just enough to brush against Ben's wrist. The gesture was so reminiscent of Emma's last conscious movement in the hospital, her small hand reaching for his, that he nearly pulled away. But something in the German shepherd's steady gaze held him, a trust so absolute and inexplicable that it felt like a command from a higher authority. "Damn it," he muttered, gathering the puppy carefully in his arms. The shepherd followed without hesitation as he carried her baby into the cramped trailer, where his old veterinary kit sat dusty and unused beneath a pile of FEMA paperwork and empty bourbon bottles. He'd kept the medical supplies out of habit more than hope, never imagining he'd need them again. The trailer's tiny kitchen table became an operating theater as Ben cleared away the detritus of his hermit existence. His hand shook as he laid the puppy on a clean towel, but as soon as he touched the small body, something shifted inside him. The tremor steadied, his breathing slowed, and for the first time in 2 years, Dr. Benjamin Crawford returned to the man he'd once been. The German shepherd positioned herself where she could watch every movement without interfering, her intelligent eyes tracking Ben's hands as he started an IV line with a needle that looked enormous against the puppy's tiny leg. She didn't flinch when he cleaned the wound with antiseptic, didn't whine when he began the delicate work of suturing torn muscle and skin. Instead, she seemed to understand that her role now was to bear witness, to hold vigil over this fragile life with the same fierce protectiveness that had brought her here in the first place. "You're lucky," Ben told the unconscious puppy as he worked, falling into the old habit of talking through procedures. "This girl of yours, she's got training. Military or police, I'd guess. She knows what medical help looks like." The shepherd's ears perked forward at his words, and he could swear he saw something like approval in her expression. As Ben sutured the deepest part of the wound, the puppy's breathing grew more labored, and for a terrifying moment he thought he was losing her. His hands froze, and the familiar panic began to rise in his chest, the same helpless terror he'd felt in the emergency room when the doctors told him there was nothing more they could do for Sarah and Emma. But then the German shepherd did something extraordinary. She placed her massive head gently against Ben's arm, not pushing or demanding, but simply offering her presence as an anchor against the storm of his own doubt. The puppy's breathing stabilized, and Ben finished the sutures with hands that had remembered their purpose. He covered the small form with a soft blanket and set up a warming lamp from his old equipment, creating a makeshift intensive care unit on his kitchen table. The German shepherd settled beside the table close enough to touch her baby, but careful not to disturb the medical equipment, and Ben found himself marveling at her restraint. A sharp knock on the trailer door interrupted the moment, followed by Margaret O'Sullivan's voice. "Benjamin Crawford, I saw that dog come in here, and I know what you're thinking. Don't you dare turn away a creature in need just because you're afraid of caring again." Ben looked from the sleeping puppy to the German shepherd, who was watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a window that had been sealed shut for too long. Margaret was right as usual. He was afraid. Terrified, actually. But this puppy was breathing. The wound was closed, and for the first time since the accident, he had succeeded in saving something that mattered. "Come in, Margaret," he called softly. "But keep your voice down. We've got a patient recovering." Margaret O'Sullivan entered the trailer with the reverent quiet of someone entering a chapel, her weathered hands clasped together as she took in the scene before her. The German shepherd looked up at her approach, but didn't move from her vigil beside the makeshift medical table, and Margaret's sharp blue eyes immediately understood the gravity of what was happening. "Sweet Mother Mary," she whispered, crossing herself as she gazed at the tiny patient. "How bad is it, Benjamin?" Ben checked the puppy's vitals again, noting the steady rise and fall of the small chest. Touch and go for the next 24 hours. Lost a lot of blood, but the wound's clean now. If infection doesn't set in... He trailed off, unwilling to voice either hope or despair. Margaret pulled up the trailer's only other chair, settling herself where she could see both the puppy and Ben's face. "That's more words than you've strung together in 3 weeks," she observed quietly. "This little one's already working miracles." The German shepherd's ears twitched at Margaret's voice, and she lifted her head to study the elderly woman with careful assessment. After a moment, she seemed to deem Margaret acceptable and returned her attention to the puppy, though Ben noticed she positioned herself so she could watch both the patient and the new arrival. "She's been trained," Ben said, nodding toward the shepherd. "Look at how she's monitoring everything, my movements, the puppy's breathing, even where you're sitting. This isn't just maternal instinct, this is professional behavior." Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the faded collar around the dog's neck. "There's writing on that collar, but I can't make it out through all the mud and wear." She reached slowly toward the shepherd, who allowed the gentle touch with stoic patience as Margaret tried to clean the metal tag with her sleeve. "Officer... something... Chen... NOPD K9. Ben's hand stilled on the puppy's blanket. "New Orleans Police Department K9 unit. She's a working dog." He studied the shepherd with new eyes, taking in the muscular build, the alert posture, the way she scanned the trailer's exits with tactical awareness. "You're a long way from your handler, aren't you, girl?" The shepherd's dark eyes met his, and Ben saw something flicker there. Not just intelligence, but grief. She understood his words, understood that he was acknowledging her loss, and the recognition of shared mourning passed between them like a secret handshake. Over the next 4 days, a routine established itself in the cramped trailer. Ben monitored the puppy's recovery with the obsessive attention he'd once reserved for his most critical cases, checking vitals every 2 hours, adjusting medications, documenting progress in a notebook that Margaret had brought him. The German shepherd, whom he'd started calling Grace after her patient, graceful movements, never left the puppy's side except for brief trips outside to relieve herself. Margaret appointed herself the operation's logistical coordinator, bringing supplies Ben didn't even know he needed. Proper blankets, a heat lamp that actually worked, and medical equipment she somehow procured from sources she refused to identify. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered," she'd say with a mischievous wink whenever Ben inquired about her connections. The puppy's recovery was remarkable. By the 3rd day, she was lifting her head and taking small amounts of formula from a syringe. By the 4th day, she was attempting to stand on unsteady legs, and Ben found himself holding his breath each time she wobbled, ready to catch her if she fell. Grace seemed to share his anxiety, positioning herself to support the puppy's attempts at mobility while encouraging her efforts with gentle nose nudges. It was during one of these tentative first steps that Ben noticed something that made his heart skip. The puppy, whom he'd started thinking of as Hope because of her remarkable resilience, had a distinctive white patch on her chest in the shape of a star, exactly like the marking on Whiskers, his family's cat who had died in his arms the night of the accident. "Margaret," he called softly, not wanting to startle either dog. "Look at this marking." Margaret adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "Well, I'll be—" "That's the same mark Emma always said made Whiskers special. Remember? She called it his lucky star." The memory hit Ben like a physical blow. Emma, 7 years old and gap-toothed, holding Whiskers up to show their dinner guests the cat's distinctive marking. "See? He's got a star right over his heart, so he'll always find his way home to us." The irony wasn't lost on him that Whiskers had died trying to return home after the accident, dragging his broken body 3 blocks to their empty house while Ben was at the hospital watching his world collapse. Grace seemed to sense his emotional shift, rising from her position to approach him. She placed her massive head against his knee, not demanding attention but offering comfort with the intuitive understanding that marked her as something more than an ordinary dog. Her presence anchored him, pulling him back from the spiral of grief and guilt that had defined his existence for 2 years. "She chose you," Margaret said quietly, watching the interaction. "Both of them did. That's not accident, Benjamin. That's providence." Ben looked at Hope, who was now sleeping peacefully in her makeshift bed, tiny paws twitching as she dreamed. He looked at Grace, whose steady presence had become the most reliable constant in his shattered world, and he looked at Margaret, whose stubborn refusal to let him disappear entirely had kept a thread of human connection alive when he'd wanted to cut all ties. "I don't know if I believe in providence anymore," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think maybe I believe in second chances." Outside the trailer, the sounds of reconstruction were growing louder as St. Bernard Parish slowly began to rebuild. But inside this small space, a different kind of reconstruction was taking place, one measured not in lumber and nails, but in the gradual mending of a heart that had thought itself permanently broken. Hope's recovery accelerated beyond Ben's most optimistic projections. By the end of the first week, she was not only walking but attempting playful pounces at Grace's tail, her tiny growls fierce with puppy determination. Grace tolerated these attacks with maternal patience, occasionally play-bowing to encourage Hope's confidence while never letting her stray far from the safety of Ben's trailer. The transformation wasn't limited to the puppy. Ben found himself waking before dawn not from nightmares of twisted metal and broken glass, but from concern about Hope's feeding schedule. His hands, steady now from purpose rather than bourbon, performed the delicate work of wound care and medication administration with the precision that had once made him legendary among New Orleans pet owners. Margaret had taken to arriving each morning with fresh coffee and updates from the neighborhood grapevine. "Mrs. Rodriguez found her cat yesterday," she announced on Thursday, settling into her usual chair beside Hope's recovery area. "Half-starved thing was hiding in what's left of the Walmart, and the Thibodeau family's dog turned up at their FEMA trailer in Baton Rouge, walked 60 miles somehow." Ben adjusted Hope's bandages, noting with satisfaction that the wound was healing cleanly. Animals have better survival instincts than we give them credit for. Grace here probably saved dozens of lives during the hurricane, didn't you, girl? Grace's ears perked at her name, and she moved closer to Ben's chair. In the week since she'd arrived, she'd developed a routine of checking on him throughout the day, bringing him her water bowl when it was empty, nudging his hand when Hope needed attention, and positioning herself between him and the door whenever strangers approached the trailer. Her protective instincts seemed to extend beyond Hope, to include Ben himself, as if she'd decided he was part of her pack now. It was during Hope's second week of recovery that Ben's carefully constructed isolation began to crack in ways he hadn't anticipated. Word of the trailer vet had spread through the displaced community, and people began appearing at his door with injured animals that had survived the hurricane's aftermath. A cat with a broken leg, a dog with infected wounds from debris, a parrot with damaged wings who wouldn't stop calling for Mama. Ben's first instinct was to refuse. He had enough responsibility with Hope's recovery, and he'd learned the hard way that caring meant losing. But Grace seemed to have other ideas. When Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese-American woman, arrived carrying an injured rabbit she'd found in the rubble of her destroyed restaurant, Grace immediately moved to the woman's side, offering support as Mrs. Chen struggled with her cane. "Please," Mrs. Chen said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I lost everything in the storm. My restaurant, my home, my son was a police officer. His name was David Chen. He had a K-9 partner, but they both—" She gestured helplessly at Grace. "This rabbit, she's all I have left. I found her in my herb garden, the only thing still growing in all that destruction." Ben looked at Grace, who was sitting perfectly still beside Mrs. Chen, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expression that seemed to say, "You know what you have to do." The name Chen echoed in his mind, connecting to the faded letters on Grace's collar, and he felt a chill of recognition run down his spine. "Bring her in," he said quietly, making space on his kitchen table. "Let's see what we can do." The rabbit's injuries were extensive but treatable, and as Ben worked, Mrs. Chen told him about her son David, who had been killed with his K-9 partner during a rescue operation in the lower 9th Ward. As she spoke of his dedication to the community, his love for his German Shepherd partner named Rex, and her pride in his service, Ben listened while suturing the rabbit's wounds. But it was Grace's reaction that held his attention. The dog had grown increasingly agitated during Mrs. Chen's story, whining softly and pacing in a way that suggested recognition rather than mere sympathy. When Mrs. Chen left with her bandaged rabbit and a supply of antibiotics, Ben knelt beside Grace and examined her collar more carefully. The metal was corroded and the lettering faded, but under the bright light of his medical lamp he could make out more of the inscription, "Officer David Chen, NOPD K-9 Unit." "Grace," he said softly, and the dog's ears came forward. "Your handler was David Chen, wasn't he? You were his partner." Grace's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She lowered her head and released a sound that was part whine, part howl, a vocalization of grief so human in its anguish that it made Ben's chest tighten with recognition. He'd made that same sound in the hospital corridor when the doctors told him Sarah and Emma wouldn't survive their injuries. "You lost him in the storm," Ben continued, his voice gentle. "And you've been taking care of the community's animals ever since, haven't you? Just like he would have wanted." Margaret, who had witnessed the entire exchange, wiped her eyes with a tissue. "No wonder she brought hope to you, Benjamin. She knows what a healer looks like." Over the following days, more animals arrived. A teenage boy named Marcus brought a dog with a dislocated shoulder. An elderly veteran carried a cat that had been poisoned by contaminated floodwater. A family of 4 appeared with 3 kittens found orphaned in an attic. Each time, Grace greeted the arrivals with professional courtesy, assessing both the humans and their animals before taking her position as Ben's unofficial assistant. Ben found himself saying yes when every instinct screamed no. But with each successful treatment, each grateful family reunited with their pet, something inside him shifted. The trailer filled with sounds he'd forgotten he missed. Margaret's delighted laughter when a kitten took its first healthy steps, Hope's excited yips when new animals arrived, the satisfied silence of creatures recovering in safety. Hope herself had become a source of joy that Ben hadn't experienced since Emma's death. The puppy's personality emerged as her strength returned, curious, brave, and remarkably intuitive about human emotions. She seemed to sense when Ben was struggling with dark memories, appearing at his side to offer the comfort of her warm body pressed against his leg. When Margaret grew melancholy talking about her late husband Patrick, Hope would curl up in the elderly woman's lap with the instinctive understanding of a natural therapy dog. It was during Hope's third week of recovery that Ben noticed the subtle changes in his own routine. He was sleeping through the night without nightmares. His hands no longer shook in the mornings. The bourbon bottle sat unopened on the shelf while coffee became his drink of choice again. The wedding ring still hung around his neck, but it no longer felt like a chain binding him to the past. Instead, it seemed like a connection to love that had existed and could exist again. Margaret noticed the changes, too. "You're humming," she announced one morning while Ben prepared Hope's breakfast. "I am not," Ben protested, but even as he said it, he realized she was right. He'd been humming Amazing Grace, Sarah's favorite hymn, while mixing the puppy's formula. "You are indeed." "Haven't heard you hum since before." Margaret's voice trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. Before September 12, 2003, before the accident that had torn his world apart, Hope chose that moment to demonstrate her newest skill, successfully navigating the small ramp Ben had built to help her reach her food bowl. She ate with the enthusiasm of complete health, her tail wagging so vigorously that her entire rear end wiggled with joy. Grace watched with obvious pride, occasionally licking Hope's ears in maternal approval. "Look at that," Margaret marveled. "She's going to be a beauty when she's grown, and smart. You can see it in her eyes." Ben studied Hope's face, noting the intelligence that sparkled there, the alertness that suggested she was already learning to read human expressions and moods. "She'll need training, proper socialization, structure." "Planning ahead, are we?" Margaret's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Ben suspicious. "I'm just being practical. If I'm going to—" He stopped, realizing what he'd almost said. "If I'm going to keep her." The words hung unspoken in the air, but their implication was clear to everyone present, including Grace, whose tail began a slow, knowing wag. Ben looked around the trailer that had become an impromptu animal hospital at the recovery area where 3 cats currently rested alongside Hope, at the supplies Margaret had somehow procured that filled every available surface. He looked at Grace, whose steady presence had become as essential to his daily routine as breathing, and he looked at Hope, who was now attempting to climb into his lap despite being barely large enough to reach his knees. "This isn't permanent," he said, but the words lacked conviction even to his own ears. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. "Of course not, dear. Nothing ever is. That's what makes it precious." The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in mid-October when Ben woke to find Grace pacing frantically around the trailer, her ears pinned back and her body language screaming distress. Hope, now nearly fully recovered and twice her original size, cowered beneath the makeshift examination table, whimpering in a way that made Ben's blood run cold. "What is it, girl?" he asked Grace, but the dog was already at the door, scratching desperately to get outside. When Ben opened it, she bolted toward the road, then stopped and looked back at him with urgent eyes, clearly wanting him to follow. Margaret appeared on her porch, her face pale. "Benjamin, there's a woman here asking questions about the dogs. Says she's from some animal welfare organization, but something about her doesn't sit right with me." Ben's stomach dropped. He'd known this day might come, the day when his unofficial animal sanctuary would attract the wrong kind of attention. "Where is she now?" "Talking to the Johnson family about their cat, but she's been asking specifically about a German Shepherd and a puppy. She knows they're here, Benjamin." Through the morning mist, Ben could see a figure moving between the trailers, clipboard in hand, talking to residents with the efficiency of someone conducting an investigation. The woman was impeccably dressed, despite the muddy conditions, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her posture radiating authority and disapproval. Grace returned to Ben's side, pressing against his legs with unusual urgency. Hope had emerged from her hiding spot and was now clinging to Ben's ankle, her small body trembling with instinctive fear. Both dogs seemed to recognize a threat that Ben was only beginning to understand. "Mrs. Crawford?" The woman's voice carried clearly across the small distance between trailers. She was approaching now, her smile as cold as her pale blue eyes. "I'm Mrs. Dorothy Whitman from the Liberation Animal Foundation. I believe you have some animals that belong in our care." Ben stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself between the woman and his dogs. "I'm Dr. Benjamin Crawford, and I'm not sure what you mean. These animals are being treated for injuries sustained during the hurricane." Mrs. Whitman's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened as they fixed on Grace. "That German Shepherd is a former police K-9 unit. These animals are trained for service, Dr. Crawford, which means they've been exploited by humans for dangerous work. My foundation specializes in liberating these creatures from further exploitation." "Liberation?" Ben's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Grace look up at him with approval. "These dogs aren't prisoners. They're family." "Family?" Mrs. Whitman's laugh was like breaking glass. "Dr. Crawford, that dog has been psychologically conditioned to serve human interests regardless of the cost to her own well-being. The puppy will be similarly corrupted if left in this environment. I have legal authority to remove animals from situations where they're being exploited." She produced a folder thick with official-looking documents. "I also have extensive funding to ensure these animals receive proper care, the kind of care that doesn't involve turning them into tools for human emotional support." Ben felt his world tilting. The woman's words carried the weight of legal authority, and her confidence suggested she'd done this before. Grace pressed closer to his legs, her body tense with the readiness to fight or flee, while hope had begun to shake so violently that Ben scooped her up without thinking. "These animals aren't being exploited," he said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "They're recovering from trauma, just like the rest of us, Mrs. Whitman's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy, if not for the coldness in her eyes. "Dr. Crawford, I understand you've suffered losses. The community has told me about your family. But using traumatized animals to fill that emotional void isn't helping them. It's perpetuating their exploitation." The words hit Ben like physical blows. Every insecurity he'd harbored about his relationship with Grace and Hope rose to the surface. Was he using them to replace what he'd lost? Was his healing coming at their expense? Margaret appeared at his elbow, her small frame radiating indignation. "Now you listen here, Missy. I've watched these animals for weeks, and I've never seen happier, healthier creatures in my life. That dog brought her baby to Benjamin because she knew he was a healer, not because she wanted to be exploited." Mrs. Whitman's smile became condescending. "Mrs. O'Sullivan. Margaret O'Sullivan. And I've lived long enough to recognize a wolf in sheep's clothing when I see one. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but animals cannot consent to the kind of emotional labor they're being asked to perform here. This German Shepherd has been trained to suppress her natural instincts in favor of human commands. The puppy is being conditioned for the same fate. My foundation has the resources and expertise to help them recover their natural behaviors." Ben looked down at Hope, who had stopped trembling and was now looking up at him with complete trust, her small tail wagging despite the tension in the air. He looked at Grace, whose steady presence had become the anchor that kept him grounded in reality. The idea of losing them felt like losing Sarah and Emma all over again. "What exactly does your foundation do with these animals?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Mrs. Whitman's expression grew serene, almost beatific. "We provide them with peaceful endings, Dr. Crawford. We free them from the burden of service. It's the kindest thing we can do for creatures who have given their entire lives to human needs." The words hit Ben like a sledgehammer. She was talking about euthanasia, killing healthy animals in the name of liberation. His hands tightened protectively around Hope, while Grace seemed to sense the threat and moved to place herself between Mrs. Whitman and Ben. "You're talking about murder," Margaret said flatly. "You want to kill these animals because they love humans." "I'm talking about mercy," Mrs. Whitman replied, her voice taking on the fervor of a true believer. "These animals have been robbed of their natural lives. The kindest thing we can do is ensure they never suffer that exploitation again." Ben felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, a determination he hadn't felt since his days as a military medic when protecting his patients had been a matter of life and death. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm going to ask you to leave. These animals are under my care, and they're staying under my care." Mrs. Whitman's facade finally cracked, revealing the steel beneath. "Dr. Crawford, I have court orders signed by Judge Harrison in Orleans Parish. These animals will come with me today, whether you cooperate or not. I also have funding offers for the families you've been treating, enough money to ensure their pets receive proper professional care instead of this amateur operation you're running out of a FEMA trailer." She gestured to the approaching vehicles, a white van with Liberation Animal Foundation painted on the side, followed by a parish sheriff's car. Ben's heart sank as he realized she'd come prepared for resistance. "The sheriff will explain the legalities," Mrs. Whitman continued, her smile returning with triumph. "But I want you to understand, Dr. Crawford, that this is truly for the best. These animals will find peace, and you'll be free to focus on your own healing without the burden of their needs." Grace stepped forward, placing herself directly between Mrs. Whitman and Ben, her hackles rising for the first time since she'd arrived at the trailer. A low growl rumbled in her chest, not aggressive, but warning. Hope squirmed in Ben's arms, trying to get closer to Grace, instinctively understanding that their pack was under threat. Ben looked at the legal documents Mrs. Whitman held, at the approaching vehicles, at the woman whose cold certainty masked something twisted and broken. He thought of David Chen, Grace's fallen partner, and wondered what he would want for his loyal K9. He thought of Hope's remarkable recovery, her growing confidence and joy, and he thought of his own healing, which had come not from using these animals, but from serving them. "Mrs. Whitman," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded in military field hospitals, "you're going to have to go through me first." The sheriff's deputy who emerged from the patrol car was a young man named Officer Rodriguez, whose uncomfortable expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than serving papers to remove beloved pets from hurricane survivors. He approached Ben with obvious reluctance, his hand resting on the folder of legal documents Mrs. Whitman had provided. "Dr. Crawford," he said quietly, "I'm real sorry about this, but I have to follow the court order. Mrs. Whitman has legal standing as a licensed animal welfare organization, and the judge has determined that these animals require specialized care for their psychological rehabilitation." Ben felt the walls closing in around him. The legal system that had once protected him as a licensed veterinarian was now being used against him by a woman whose definition of animal welfare was fundamentally twisted. Hope sensed his distress and burrowed deeper into his arms, while Grace positioned herself with tactical precision, ready to defend her pack. "Officer Rodriguez, these animals aren't being abused or neglected. They're thriving. Can't you see that?" Ben gestured to Hope's bright eyes and healthy coat, to Grace's alert but calm demeanor. Mrs. Whitman stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Officer, I know this appears harsh, but Dr. Crawford has developed an unhealthy attachment to these animals. He's projecting his grief over his deceased family onto creatures who should be allowed to live naturally, without the burden of human emotional dependency. The words struck Ben like physical blows, each one designed to hit his deepest insecurities. Was she right? Had his need for Grace and Hope's companionship corrupted his judgment? The doubt that had plagued him since the accident rose to the surface, paralyzing him with familiar guilt. Margaret O'Sullivan had no such hesitations. The elderly woman stepped between the deputy and Ben, her weathered hands planted firmly on her hips. "Officer Rodriguez, I've known your grandmother Maria for 40 years, and she'd be ashamed to see you helping this woman steal family pets from hurricane survivors." Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I don't have a choice. The court order is valid, and Mrs. Whitman has documentation showing these animals require specialized intervention." Mrs. Whitman smiled with cold satisfaction. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I understand your emotional attachment, but emotion cannot override legal authority. These animals will receive the care they need at our facility, where they'll be free from the psychological manipulation that occurs when humans use them as emotional support objects." As she spoke, more neighbors began to emerge from their trailers, drawn by the commotion. The Johnsons appeared with their recently treated cat, the Martinez family carried their recovered dog, and old Mr. Thibodeau limped over with his injured parrot perched on his shoulder. Word had spread quickly through the tight-knit community of survivors, and they were rallying to Ben's defense. "That man saved my Bella's life," Mrs. Johnson called out, holding up her cat. "Free care, gentle treatment, and look at her now, healthy as she ever was. Dr. Crawford didn't charge us nothing for fixing Pedro's wing," Mr. Thibodeau added, his parrot squawking agreement. "Man's got the gentlest hands with hurt animals I ever seen." Mrs. Whitman's expression hardened as she faced the growing crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your gratitude, but amateur veterinary care provided by an unlicensed practitioner in unsanitary conditions is not in your pet's best interests. My foundation can provide proper professional care." "He is licensed," Margaret shot back. Benjamin Crawford was one of the finest veterinarians in New Orleans before the accident, and he's still got more skill in his little finger than most folks have in their whole bodies. Ben barely heard the argument swirling around him. He was staring at Mrs. Whitman's face, seeing something beneath her composed exterior that made his blood run cold. There was something broken in her eyes, a fanaticism that spoke of personal trauma driving her crusade. This wasn't about animal welfare. This was about her own unhealed wounds. "Mrs. Whitman," he said quietly, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "What happened to you? What made you believe that love is exploitation?" For a moment her mask slipped, and Ben saw raw pain flash across her features. "Love?" she spat. "Is that what you call it when we send these innocent creatures into harm's way because we're too cowardly to face danger ourselves? When we train them to sacrifice their lives for our convenience?" The truth hit Ben like lightning. You lost someone, a canine handler, someone you loved who died with their dog. Mrs. Whitman's composure cracked completely. "My son Michael was a canine officer with the Pentagon Police. He died in 9/11 with his partner Rex, trying to save people who were already dead. That dog followed him into hell because we taught him that human lives matter more than his own. If I hadn't encouraged Michael's career, if I hadn't been so proud of him and his heroic partner, they'd both still be alive." The crowd fell silent as the weight of her grief filled the air. Ben felt his anger transform into something deeper, recognition of a wound that mirrored his own. "Mrs. Whitman, your son chose to serve. So did Rex. Taking that choice away from other animals won't bring them back. Choice? Her laugh was bitter and broken. Animals don't choose to serve humans, Dr. Crawford. We manipulate their loyalty and call it choice. We exploit their love and call it partnership. I won't let it happen again. Not to these dogs, not to any others I can save. Grace, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward. She approached Mrs. Whitman slowly, deliberately, her body language shifting from defensive to something that looked almost like recognition. When she reached the older woman, Grace sat and lifted one paw, the gesture of a trained canine requesting permission to interact. Mrs. Whitman stared at Grace in shock. "No," she whispered. "Don't you dare try to manipulate me with his training. I won't fall for it." But Grace wasn't following training. She was offering comfort with the same intuitive understanding she'd shown Ben, sensing the depth of Mrs. Whitman's pain and responding to it. The dog's dark eyes held no demand, no expectation, only the patient offer of connection from one grieving soul to another. "She's not trying to serve you," Ben said softly. "She's trying to help you heal. That's what love looks like, not exploitation, but mutual support." Mrs. Whitman's hands trembled as she stared at Grace. "Rex used to do that. When Michael was stressed about exams or worried about a case, Rex would sit just like that and wait until Michael was ready for comfort. I thought it was beautiful then. I thought it showed how much they loved each other." "It did," Ben said. "It still does. Grace chose to bring hope to me because she recognized someone who could help. She stays because she wants to, not because she has to. Look at her, Mrs. Whitman. Really look at her. Does she seem exploited to you?" Mrs. Whitman's careful composure finally shattered completely, and she collapsed to her knees in the mud, years of suppressed grief pouring out in wrenching sobs. Grace immediately moved closer, offering her presence without forcing contact, while Hope squirmed in Ben's arms, her small voice adding soft whimpers of sympathy to the moment. The sound of Mrs. Whitman's breakdown seemed to crack something open in the morning air, releasing years of accumulated grief and guilt that had been compressed into her mission of liberation. Officer Rodriguez stood frozen, his hand still on the legal documents that suddenly seemed less important than the human suffering unfolding before him. The gathered neighbors watched in stunned silence as this composed, authoritative woman dissolved into raw vulnerability. Grace remained perfectly still beside Mrs. Whitman, neither advancing nor retreating, simply offering her presence with the patient understanding of a creature who had witnessed profound loss. Ben found himself kneeling beside both of them, Hope still cradled in his arms, drawn by an instinct that transcended the conflict of moments before. "How many?" Ben asked quietly. "How many animals have you liberated?" Mrs. Whitman's voice came in broken whispers between sobs. 247. Dogs, mostly. Some cats. All of them trained for service, all of them guilty of the crime of loving humans too much. She looked up at Ben with eyes red from tears and years of sleepless nights. "I told myself I was saving them from exploitation, from the kind of fate that took Michael and Rex. But I was really killing them because I couldn't bear to see that love anymore. It reminded me too much of what I'd lost." The magnitude of her confession hit the crowd like a physical force. Margaret O'Sullivan crossed herself, whispering a prayer for the souls of the innocent animals who had died for one woman's misguided grief. Officer Rodriguez let the legal papers flutter to the ground, his face pale with the realization of what he'd almost been complicit in. "Mrs. Whitman," Ben said gently, "grief can make us do terrible things when we don't know how to carry it. I know. I spent 2 years drinking myself toward death because I couldn't live with the guilt of failing to save my family. These animals, Grace and Hope, they didn't exploit my grief. They helped me learn to carry it differently." Mrs. Whitman's eyes fixed on Hope, who was watching her with the innocent curiosity of a puppy too young to understand adult pain but old enough to recognize suffering. "She looks like Rex did when he was young. Michael used to carry him everywhere, even when he got too big for it. He said Rex was his partner, not his tool." "Partnership," Ben repeated. "That's what this is. Not exploitation, not manipulation. Partnership. Grace brings me animals who need help because she knows I can provide it. I care for them because they've given me a reason to care again. We help each other." Mrs. Whitman reached out tentatively toward Hope, her hand shaking. The puppy, with the fearless trust of the very young, stretched her nose forward to sniff Mrs. Whitman's fingers. The contact seemed to break something loose in the older woman's chest, and she took a shuddering breath. "I've been so wrong," she whispered. "So terribly, horribly wrong. All those animals, they weren't suffering from love. I was suffering from its absence." Margaret O'Sullivan stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding any anger she might have felt. "Honey, recognizing a wrong is the first step toward making it right. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Mrs. Whitman looked around at the faces surrounding her, neighbors who had been ready to defend Ben and his animals, Officer Rodriguez, who was quietly tearing up the court documents, and Ben himself, who held no accusation in his eyes despite what she had almost done. "I have resources," she said slowly, her voice gaining strength. "Money, connections, legal standing. The Liberation Animal Foundation has a $2 million endowment that I've been using to fund euthanasia programs. What if I used it differently?" Ben felt a spark of possibility ignite in his chest. "What are you thinking?" "A real sanctuary. Not liberation through death, but through healing. A place where service animals can retire with dignity, where injured animals can recover, where the bond between humans and animals is celebrated rather than severed." She looked directly at Grace, who was still sitting patiently beside her. "A place where love is recognized as partnership, not exploitation." The transformation in Mrs. Whitman's voice was remarkable. The cold authority had been replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. Ben could see the woman she had been before grief twisted her purpose, someone who had genuinely loved animals and wanted to protect them. "It would need proper facilities," Ben said, his veterinary mind already working through the logistics. "Medical equipment, trained staff, legal protection for the animals, and someone who understands both healing and loss," Mrs. Whitman added, looking at him meaningfully. "Someone who's experienced the kind of partnership I've been too blind to see." Margaret clapped her hands together with delight. "Well, I'll be. Looks like our little trailer operation is about to grow up." But even as hope began to bloom, Ben felt the familiar tug of fear. Expansion meant exposure, responsibility for more lives, more opportunities for failure. Grace seemed to sense his hesitation and moved to press against his leg, her warm presence a reminder of the trust that had brought them together. "I don't know if I'm ready for something that big," Ben admitted. "What if I fail them? What if I can't be what they need?" Mrs. Whitman's smile was sad but genuine. "Dr. Crawford, do you think Michael was ready to run into a burning building? Do you think Rex was ready to face whatever killed them both?" "Sometimes readiness isn't what matters. Sometimes all that matters is love and the willingness to try." Hope chose that moment to demonstrate her recovery by squirming out of Ben's arms and toddling over to Mrs. Whitman on unsteady legs. The puppy settled herself directly on the older woman's lap, as if claiming her as part of the pack. Mrs. Whitman's tears started again, but these were different, cleaner somehow. "She's choosing you," Ben observed, "just like Grace chose me. The question is, Will you let her?" Mrs. Whitman's hands settled gently on Hope's small form, and for the first time since Ben had met her, she looked truly peaceful. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen by something innocent, to be trusted without earning it." Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, about those court orders. I think there might have been some procedural errors. Might need to review the whole case, Mrs." Whitman laughed, a sound completely unlike her earlier cold amusement. "Officer, I hereby withdraw all legal claims against Dr. Crawford and request that any related documentation be destroyed. The Liberation Animal Foundation is officially changing its mission statement." The crowd that had gathered to defend Ben began to disperse, but not before each family stopped to shake Mrs. Whitman's hand or offer words of encouragement. The transformation in community dynamics was palpable. What had begun as a crisis had become an opportunity for healing that extended far beyond the original conflict. As the excitement died down, Ben found himself alone with Mrs. Whitman, Grace, and Hope in front of his trailer. The older woman was still holding the puppy, who had fallen asleep in her lap with the complete trust of the very young. "Mrs. Whitman," Ben said carefully, "building a real sanctuary, doing this right, it's going to take time, years, probably. And there's going to be loss along the way. Animals we can't save, decisions that feel impossible to make. Are you prepared for that?" She looked down at Hope's sleeping form, then up at Grace, who was watching both of them with alert intelligence. "Dr. Crawford, I've spent 4 years killing animals to avoid the pain of loving them. I think it's time I learned to love them despite the pain. Will you teach me?" Ben thought of Sarah, who had always believed that love was worth the risk of loss. He thought of Emma, whose joy had never been diminished by the knowledge that everything beautiful was also fragile. And he thought of Grace and Hope, who had chosen to trust him despite having every reason to fear humans. "We'll teach each other," he said finally, "all of us together." As if in response to his words, Grace moved to sit between Ben and Mrs. Whitman, creating a circle that included Hope's sleeping form. The morning sun, which had risen on conflict and fear, now illuminated something entirely different, the beginning of healing that would extend far beyond any of them had imagined possible. In the distance, Margaret O'Sullivan watched from her porch, a satisfied smile on her weathered face. "Sometimes," she murmured to Patrick's photograph, "Grace really does find us when we need it most." 5 years after Hurricane Katrina had torn through their lives, the Crawford Animal Sanctuary stood as a testament to the healing power of second chances. What had begun as a desperate act of mercy in a FEMA trailer had grown into a sprawling facility that occupied 15 acres of Louisiana countryside, complete with modern veterinary buildings, rehabilitation areas, and comfortable retirement homes for animals who had served their communities with distinction. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the main treatment center, where Dr. Benjamin Crawford was examining a recently retired military working dog named Sergeant, a German shepherd whose tour in Afghanistan had left him with physical scars and emotional trauma. Beside Ben, Dr. Lisa Chen, his wife of 3 years and the sanctuary's head veterinarian, was preparing a treatment plan that would address both the dog's medical needs and his psychological recovery. "His stress responses are textbook PTSD," Lisa observed, watching as Sergeant flinched at the sound of a door closing somewhere in the building. "But look at how he responds to Grace." Indeed, Grace, now 8 years old and the sanctuary's unofficial therapy coordinator, had positioned herself where Sergeant could see her without feeling threatened. Her calm presence seemed to communicate to the traumatized dog that this was a safe space, a place where service animals could finally rest. Hope, now 5 and fully trained as a therapy dog, was working in the sanctuary's children's wing, where young visitors learned about animal care and emotional healing. Through the window, Ben could see her lying patiently as a group of elementary school children took turns reading to her, their voices carrying the careful pronunciation of new readers who had found in Hope an audience that never judged their mistakes. Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, now simply called Dorothy by everyone at the sanctuary, appeared in the doorway of the treatment room, her silver hair catching the morning light. At 73, she had traded her severe business suits for comfortable jeans and volunteer shirts, her transformation from zealot to healer complete in ways that sometimes still amazed Ben. In her arms was a small carrier containing the sanctuary's newest arrival. "Dr. Crawford, we have an emergency intake," she said, her voice carrying the professional calm that had replaced her former coldness. "State police found this one on the highway. Looks like she was thrown from a moving vehicle." Ben's heart clenched as he took the carrier and peered inside. A young beagle mix, barely out of puppyhood, cowered in the corner with injuries that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accident. Her brown eyes held the same desperate hope he had seen in Grace's gaze 5 years earlier, the look of a creature who still believed in the possibility of kindness despite evidence to the contrary. "What kind of monster throws a puppy from a car?" Lisa asked, her professional composure wavering as she examined the small patient. "The kind that Mrs. Whitman and I used to be in different ways," Ben replied quietly, beginning his examination with the gentle precision that had become his trademark. "People who are so broken themselves that they can't recognize innocence when they see it." Dorothy nodded sadly. "I called her Mercy," she said. "Seemed appropriate." As Ben worked to assess Mercy's injuries, a broken rib, severe road rash, and dehydration, Grace appeared at his side with the intuitive timing that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. She seemed to understand that this case required her special attention, settling herself where the frightened puppy could see her while Ben provided medical care. The sanctuary buzzed with quiet activity around them. Margaret O'Sullivan, now 80 and the facility's beloved grandmother, was leading a group of retired volunteers in preparing enrichment activities for the animals. Her arthritis had slowed her down, but her spirit remained indomitable, and her presence brought a family atmosphere to the sanctuary that made both animals and humans feel at home. In the distance, Ben could see the memorial garden where they honored animals who had passed peacefully in their care, including Rex, Mrs. Whitman's son's canine partner, who had been found alive after all these years and had lived out his final 2 years at the sanctuary surrounded by love. Mrs. Whitman visited his grave every morning, but the tears she shed there now were tears of gratitude rather than guilt. "Dr. Crawford?" came a voice from the doorway. Officer Rodriguez, now a sergeant himself and a regular volunteer at the sanctuary, stood with a young boy of about 10 whose face was streaked with dirt and tears. "This is Miguel Santos. He says this puppy belongs to him." Ben looked up from his work, noting the boy's defensive posture and the way his eyes never left Mercy. "Miguel, can you tell me what happened to your dog?" The boy's story came out in broken fragments. His family was being evicted from their apartment. His stepfather, drunk and angry, had grabbed Mercy and thrown her into their car, then tossed her out the window when she wouldn't stop crying. Miguel had tried to stop him, but had been pushed aside. He'd been searching for Mercy for 2 days, sleeping in bus stops and asking strangers if they'd seen a small beagle. Dorothy knelt beside Miguel, her voice gentle in a way that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. "Sweetheart, your puppy is very hurt, but Dr. Crawford is going to help her get better. The question is, what's going to happen to both of you after that?" The complexity of the situation wasn't lost on any of the adults present. Miguel clearly loved Mercy, but returning the dog to a home where she'd been abused wasn't an option. Yet separating a child from his beloved pet would create a different kind of cruelty. "Miguel," Ben said carefully, would you like to help me take care of Mercy while she recovers? You could learn about animal care, and we could figure out together what's best for her." The boy's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "You mean I could stay with her?" Lisa and Dorothy exchanged glances, both thinking of the sanctuary's education program and the small residence facility they'd built for situations exactly like this. "What if," Lisa suggested, "we called social services and explained that Miguel could be part of our youth mentorship program while Mercy recovers?" Sometimes healing works better when it happens together. The next few hours were a whirlwind of phone calls, paperwork, and careful negotiations. The sanctuary's reputation in the community had grown to the point where their recommendations carried significant weight with local authorities. Miguel's grandmother, located in Baton Rouge, agreed to take custody of her grandson and was thrilled to learn about the sanctuary's educational programs. As afternoon settled into evening, Ben found himself in the sanctuary's main building, watching Miguel gently stroke Mercy's head while she slept in her recovery kennel. The boy had proven to have a natural gentleness with animals, and his presence seemed to comfort the injured puppy in ways that medical treatment alone couldn't achieve. Grace lay beside the kennel, having appointed herself as Mercy's guardian, while Hope worked her therapy magic on Miguel, sensing the deep wounds that years of instability had left in the young boy's heart. The scene was a microcosm of everything the sanctuary had become, a place where healing happened not through isolation but through connection. "You know," Dorothy said, settling into the chair beside Ben, "5 years ago, I would have seen this situation as proof that animals and humans shouldn't form attachments. Too much pain, too much risk of loss." Ben smiled, watching as Miguel whispered promises to Mercy about all the adventures they'd have when she was well. "And now?" "Now I see that the pain isn't the problem. It's the love that makes us willing to bear the pain. Miguel's love for Mercy didn't cause her suffering. It's what's going to heal both of them." Lisa joined them, carrying their 18-month-old daughter Emma Margaret, who immediately reached for Grace with the fearless affection of a child who had grown up surrounded by gentle animals. The toddler's presence brought a new dimension to the sanctuary, teaching both animals and visitors about the pure joy that could exist between species when trust was established early. "The Peterson Foundation called," Lisa announced. "They want to feature us in their national campaign about animal-assisted therapy. It could mean significant funding expansion." Ben felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied growth and recognition. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought scrutiny. But as he watched Miguel's gentle care of Mercy, Grace's protective presence, and Hope's intuitive therapy work, he realized that their mission had grown beyond his personal fears. "What do you think, Grace?" he asked the dog who had started it all. "Ready to be famous?" Grace's tail wagged once, but her attention remained focused on Mercy and Miguel, as if to remind him that fame was irrelevant compared to the immediate work of healing that happened one relationship at a time. Margaret appeared with her evening rounds, bringing blankets for Miguel and checking on each animal with the thoroughness of someone who considered them all family. At 80, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her presence remained a stabilizing force in the sanctuary's daily rhythm. "Benjamin," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about Patrick lately, about how he always said that love wasn't something you fell into, but something you climbed toward, one choice at a time." Ben looked around the sanctuary, at the animals who had found safety, the humans who had found purpose, and the relationships that had formed between species in ways that defied easy explanation. I think he was right. Every day here is a choice to climb a little higher. As night settled over the sanctuary, Ben made his final rounds, checking on animals and securing buildings with the routine that had become sacred to him. Grace accompanied him, as she had every night for 5 years, her presence a reminder of the morning when a crying dog had brought him a dying puppy and changed the trajectory of his life. In Mercy's kennel, Miguel had fallen asleep in a chair beside his recovering pet, his hand resting protectively on her small form. Hope lay curled at the boy's feet, providing comfort even in sleep. The image would have been impossible 5 years earlier: a damaged child, an abused puppy, and a therapy dog creating a circle of healing that transcended their individual traumas. Ben paused at the memorial garden, where moonlight illuminated the simple stones marking animals who had found peace at the sanctuary. Sarah's and Emma's names were there too, not because they were buried there, but because their love had been part of the foundation upon which everything else was built. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to the memory of his first family, to Grace, who had trusted him with Hope's life, and to all the second chances that had led to this moment. Grace pressed against his leg, her warm presence a bridge between past grief and present joy, between the man who had been broken and the healer he had become. Together, they walked back toward the main building, where the lights of the sanctuary glowed like a beacon in the darkness, promising safety to any creature brave enough to trust in the possibility of love. In the morning, there would be new animals to heal, new relationships to nurture, and new opportunities to prove that grace, in all its forms, could transform even the most broken hearts. But tonight, there was peace, and the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived in service to something larger than themselves. The dog had cried and brought a dying baby to a man who thought he was finished with healing. Neither of them had known it would change not just their lives, but the lives of countless others who would find their way to this place where love was recognized not as exploitation, but as the highest form of partnership between souls willing to choose each other again and again, one day at a time. After decades of believing that our best years are behind us, that second chances are for the young, Grace and Hope's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself in our supposed twilight years. Like Ben at 52, many of us carry wounds we think have defined our worth: the loss of a spouse, children who've moved away, careers that ended too soon, dreams that feel impossible to resurrect. But what if those very wounds are what qualify us to heal others? What if the emptiness we feel isn't an ending, but a space waiting to be filled with something beautiful and unexpected? Ben thought he was saving a dying puppy, but Grace was really saving a dying man's capacity to love again. She saw in his weathered hands not failure, but the gentleness that comes from having known loss. At 55, 60, or 68, we still have so much love to give, so much wisdom to share. The question isn't whether we're too old to start over. It's whether we're brave enough to let something small and trusting choose us again. Sometimes grace finds us when we've stopped looking for it, reminding us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. What childhood dream have you put aside that might still be calling to you? Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment where you felt truly needed again? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.